On behalf of Karen, myself, just wanted to welcome everyone here as well. I just want to go over briefly the agenda, and then I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Pritzker. But we basically have now from 9:30 to 11:30. I'm not used to using this gavel, but Tricia said we would probably need it just to keep us in line, because we are, in the core of it, going to be going through the 8 recommendations, and we want to have some discussion around those and make sure that there's time to do it. So please forgive me up front if I do cut, and Karen and I both cut the things short just to continue we move through it. Ambassador Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, is going to come over. She was going to come at the beginning. She's not. She will come at some point, and then we'll just adjust the process as we go. But I want to turn it over to Secretary Pritzker just for some remarks, and then we're going to get into the recommendations.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dominic and Karen, for your leadership, and I want to thank you all for joining us this morning at the first meeting of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. Our gathering today is part of the administration's effort to write the next paragraphs of what President Obama called a new chapter, and I quote, a new chapter in U.S.-Africa relations. And our meeting is intended to build on what was a historic U.S.-Africa business forum that we held last August, when U.S. firms announced more than $14 billion worth of investments in African markets. We want to see that kind of economic engagement grow and continue, which is why I was honored when the President asked me to establish this council and to ensure that the private sector's perspective is factored into our policy making. Your strategic recommendations will help us align our government's activities with your business's priorities in order to increase trade and create jobs both in the United States and across Africa. All of us in this room recognize Africa's vast economic potential. The job of this council is to advise the Department of Commerce and the entire Obama administration on how to expand trade and investment opportunities for U.S. firms in Africa and how to create opportunities for African companies that want to do business here in the United States. The goal is to facilitate closer ties between the United States and the 54 distinct nations of Africa. To meet this charge, the Council is focused on 4 key areas. First, mobilizing capital. Robust capital markets are essential for any nation to attract long-term investment. The Council is particularly focused on strengthening capital markets in Africa. On this front, the Commerce Department will soon launch an investor roadshow to provide U.S. financial firms and exporters with the opportunity to hear directly from African governments about their investment climates and specific infrastructure projects, and to assess and address real market risks. This roadshow is still in the planning stages, and so we are asking you, please, to help us to make this project as effective and useful as possible. We're also interested in your thoughts on creating and maintaining an effective online investor toolkit, which will help U.S. businesses learn how and know more about identifying African partners and viable projects. The government and the private sector need to partner to provide expertise and technical assistance to African countries as they develop and strengthen their capital markets. The second area of focus here is improving supply chain efficiency. So ensuring quick and easy movement of imports and exports can help reduce cost, increase efficiency of trade, and boost government revenues. The Department of Commerce has already initiated a public-private sector dialogue focused on best practices in strengthening supply chains in East Africa. But we need your guidance, in particular on the development of reliable cold chain infrastructure, and then more broadly in developing reliable supply chains in general. Developing an integrated cold chain is key for African countries to grow, compete, and attract investments, not only in agribusiness, but in retail, franchising, and pharmaceuticals. So making progress on this issue will create opportunities for American companies in everything from food processing to warehousing to transportation. Third key area is infrastructure. American companies have expertise and experience in developing world-class infrastructure. Yet, at the Commerce Department, we've heard repeatedly from U.S. companies about the challenge of competing on a level playing field with foreign firms to win major infrastructure projects. So your recommendation to create a U.S.-Africa Infrastructure Center to identify, vet, and prioritize African infrastructure projects is a start, and it will help change that dynamic. I also commend you for focusing on an often overlooked area, the healthcare infrastructure development. Moving forward, I love this council to consider how the U.S. government as a whole can support our companies as they compete for infrastructure and other investments across Africa. And later today, I know we'll talk in more detail about this. We have some further ideas we'd like to share. Finally, I want to touch on the issue of improving the perception of doing business in Africa. There are many misperceptions, and companies often lack the market intelligence needed to fully commit to opportunities in Africa. So the Department of Commerce has solutions. We have data, we have market expertise, and we have great people. Our Foreign Commercial Service has a full range of tools and services at your disposal, including staff on the ground to help U.S. companies succeed in Africa. The federal government has many tools and people available to you on the ground throughout Africa. We need your ideas as to how we better get the word out about the resources that do exist today that are available to help companies do more business in Africa. So let me close by briefly updating you on what the Department of Commerce will be doing in particular in the months ahead. In May, the Department of Commerce will hold the 2015 Africa and Middle East Business Outlook Conference in Dubai. This event will bring together American, Emirati, and African leaders to collaborate on supply chain, financing, and infrastructure issues in the region. In addition, in June, there's an infrastructure trade mission to Mozambique, South Africa, and Kenya, and that trade mission is still open. We encourage anyone who's interested to apply. The Investor Roadshow that I previously mentioned to mobilize private sector capital in the East African communities. And then in September, there will be a Trade Winds Conference where U.S. firms will be able to explore opportunities in 8 markets in sub-Saharan Africa. So I look forward to our discussions today. However, please keep in mind, as we've talked about, that we want to prioritize your advice to us, things that we can get done in the short term, things that we can lay the groundwork for in the medium and long term. So I appreciate your thinking about, as you make recommendations, that they are those that have the highest return and are the most actionable. I look forward to working with you on this council to make doing business in Africa easier for U.S. companies and to keep America and Africa open for business together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Pritzker. And again, thank you just for your commitment and time you're spending on this last night. A really good discussion on where we're going on and just with the whole department and the support you're getting. We really appreciate it today. And it's a great honor to introduce Ambassador Susan Rice, President Obama's National Security Advisor. I don't think Susan needs any introduction other than she's a long friend of Africa, spending many years there as the Assistant Secretary of State in Africa and has made a big difference in that part of the world. So we're honored that you're here.
Thanks very much, Dominic. Thank you, Karen. Penny, thank you for all you've done to bring this together. And I want to thank the entire council because the President values enormously the good work that you're doing. This is a signature initiative on his part, which you'll recall goes back to the historic U.S.-Africa Summit last year. And the work that you're doing, the recommendations that you're pulling together, and that we'll have the opportunity to discuss and flesh out today, we really think can provide a very powerful roadmap for how we strengthen and deepen the ties between the United States and Africa and build investment and trade relationships that are beneficial for both the United States, our economy, our job creation, and obviously that of the people of Africa. As Dominic mentioned, I spent a fair number of years early on in my career working on Africa, and one of the things that we were most proud of back in the day was the passage of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And now we are working hard with Congress to try to ensure its long-term extension and renewal. And we appreciate very much the work that many of you have done to help us push that over the finish line. It remains a challenge. It's not done, but I think it is one of the foundational pillars of the U.S.-Africa economic relationship and can continue to be highly impactful as we move forward. We very much want to see the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship grow. If you look back as to where we've come, our exports to sub-Saharan Africa since 2009 have grown by 2/3, but that's still just a fraction, as you know, of what we ought to be accomplishing. Of all the goods that we export to the world, only 1% still goes to sub-Saharan Africa. 1% for an entire continent. In President Obama's words, he says, and obviously we all agree, we have to do better, and a lot better. So against that backdrop, we launched in 2012 a strategic review of our U.S. policy towards Africa. It had been many years since any administration had done that. And in the context of that, we pledged to elevate our efforts to spur economic growth, including through the Doing Business in Africa campaign. We wanted to make it easier for American companies to find opportunities and seize them on the continent and encourage more businesses to take a serious look at Africa, because as you know as well as anybody, there are enormous misperceptions, sweeping assumptions, oversimplifications about the business environment in Africa, and that obscures what are some very real and lucrative opportunities that some of our partners and competitors around the world are seemingly undeterred by. So we really see the path ahead as one that is very impactful. We also, though, think there's a vital relationship not only between the deals that we can do in Africa, and you'll recall that at the summit last year, some $33 billion in deals were committed to, but we also think that the broad work that we're doing on development, on investing in human capital, are critical elements of reinforcing our overall economic relationship. We look around, we see countries like China and others, India, Turkey, the list goes on, Brazil stepping up their economic engagement in Africa, and we feel very strongly in the administration, and I think this is a view shared by those who are knowledgeable in Congress, that there is no reason why the United States should not be the primary partner of choice for African institutions, African companies, African governments that want to improve their infrastructure and invest in new technologies. And the work that you're doing, the recommendations you're providing us with, I think will equip us to take advantage of those opportunities. The series of initiatives that we have launched on the development side, as I said, are quite complementary, particularly when it comes to the infrastructure challenge. Our Power Africa initiative, as you know, has mobilized more than $29 billion in public and private sector commitments to expand access to reliable electricity across the continent. With regard to food security, we're working closely with partners in Africa so that mothers and children can get proper nutrition and farmers can boost their incomes. We're working to strengthen Africa's health systems, and we note with interest the recommendations you're making with regard to that, so that fewer people are dying from preventable diseases. I think the notion that we should broaden our investment, which is so considerable in the health sector, to be as broad-based as possible and to not be as narrowly focused as it was originally on dealing with the very important, but obviously not the only challenge of fighting HIV/AIDS, and really helping to build healthcare infrastructure that's sustainable is a very important recommendation, and one that I think is very much in the vein of what we are increasingly looking to do and trying to do with our global health security agenda, but also with the President's own health initiative in Africa, which has tried to leverage resources that are useful to combat the AIDS epidemic with opportunities to broaden health systems and build healthcare human capital accordingly. You all know that the President will travel back to Africa for the third time this summer. He'll go to Kenya, where he'll participate in the Global Entrepreneurship Summit and have the opportunity to hear directly from young entrepreneurs in the African region. And we really look forward to this because in addition to supporting entrepreneurs, not just in Africa, but around the world, we're focused on the simultaneous imperative of increasing access to finance, and to, as we do so, take on, as I said earlier, the very corrosive misperceptions about the business environment in Africa and the sweeping generalities that we often hear associated with the challenge and the opportunity of working in Africa. I mean, obviously, we can't ignore the headlines and the things like the Ebola epidemic and conflict zones that we all know are so costly and devastating. But that's only part of the picture, and you know that better than most. It's not just a joke for Trevor Noah to point out that, you know, there's more Ebola in the United States than there is in South Africa at present. So I'm looking forward to him taking over from Jon Stewart. Anyway, I digress. The point is that that we do need to do a far better job of educating the American public, but also educating American businesses about the opportunities that are out there, and the fact that they have to look at a continent of 53, 54 countries as diverse as it in fact is, and to make the distinctions that we seem better equipped to make in Latin America or Asia or other parts of the world where indeed many of the same challenges of corruption, poor infrastructure, weak governance in fact pertain. So bottom line is we are extremely grateful for what you're doing. We value very much the perspectives and insights that you're bringing to us. We look forward to making the very most of your recommendations and your experience. And we do so with a very clear-cut appreciation of the fact that what is good for development and growth and job creation in Africa can and must be and should be good for the United States and for American business. We see this as a very simple synergy, and one that we want to take maximum advantage of, both for reasons of self-interest and profit, but also for reasons of development, conflict prevention and resolution, and our very enduring commitment to human rights and humanitarian issues. So for all of those reasons, this is vital. The President very much appreciates all that you're doing. And we look forward to the results of today and beyond. So thank you very much. Okay. Good to see you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rice. I mean, that just, again, I think emphasizes the importance of this, and we really appreciate you spending the time here with everything you're doing. So thank you. Thank you. So if you don't mind, I think we'll just roll right on into it. Karen and I were just going to make some brief introductory remarks on it. There's a couple of just bureaucratic things I wouldn't mind doing. One is for the council members, we put under your files the list of the 8 recommendations that we've got. And given what Secretary Pritzker was saying last night about the need to prioritize and where things are, what we'd like you to do during the course of the day is if you could allocate 100 points across those 8, and at the end of the day, we'll pick them up, or 11:30, and we'll just get a sense from the group about, because this is the first time we've actually all been together in one place, just to get a sense of where it is. We've also left a little blank at the bottom, not enough space. If there are other ideas that we're hearing as well, we've heard some this morning that we think are not on here but should be on here. Let's also, we just want to capture those as well too. Please feel free to write on the back of the page. We haven't left you much space. So that's just wanted to point that out to you on that. I also I wanted to thank the staff who've been working with us, many of you who are around here, because you've done a lot of the hard legwork. So I think on behalf of all of the 14 council members here, we want to thank the staff for the significant work. I think it's been we've all been excited with the engagement and the discussions that have gone on, and look forward to more as this continues as we go ahead. I only wanted to make a couple of introductory remarks. I think we've all heard about the opportunity. Again, Secretary Pritzker, I think, laid it out very nicely in the context of 2.7 billion people, I think, going into the middle class over the next 20 years in the world. It's mainly going to be in Asia and Africa. I think all of us here are complete African fanatics. We've drank the Kool-Aid, I think, so we're there. But I think it's worth reminding us of some of the opportunity that you actually see in Africa. And there were a couple of things just wanted to put on that. I think we've talked about the growth rate in Africa over the last 15 years at about 5% a year. I think what's particularly interesting is the fact that a very small part of that actually comes from resources. Only 11% of the growth that we've seen actually comes from resources. So yes, Africa is very rich in resources and will continue to play an important role over time in ag, food, and energy and minerals. But it's also got a very attractive consumer base that's there. It's actually the African middle class that's driving a lot of the changes that are going on. And I think that's why a lot of companies outside of Africa are looking at it as the strategic spot to be in. There'll be 100 million new households, middle-class households coming into play in the next 15 years, 100 million new households. That number is significant for any global company if you want to be relevant. The other number I just put out there is, it was mentioned last night, the demographic boom that's occurring. I think it's a billion people over the next 25 years. Nigeria will have more babies born this year than all of Europe combined, right? Just to give a sense. So if you're Procter & Gamble and you want to be relevant and you sell diapers, you've got to be in Nigeria, right, is where we are. And I think a lot of us have to realize we have to get there. There are about 400 U.S. companies today that make over $1 billion in revenues in Africa. So they're there, and many of the clients that we see would say that in the multinationals that the future global CEO is right now in Africa, much like it was in Asia 15 to 20 years ago. The new hotbed for growing leadership is actually in this part of the world. So I think we see that opportunity. I think there's been some significant growth over time in exports and investment. I think the thing that we are concerned about is our sort of competitive position. If we compare ourselves to some other countries and so forth, has actually decreased over the last 15 years. And that's where Karen and I are very keen on that we actually have a big ambition. Just to remind ourselves where it is. The U.S. trade share fell from 13% to 6% over the last 10 years, even though while we're actually increasing our trade, but our share fell. And what we've seen with China, for example, is they've gone from 3% to 14% in that time frame. And I think, again, I love this notion of commercial diplomacy that you mentioned. I think there's a lot of interest and obviously benefits that U.S. companies are seeing. We think there's much more to be seen. And just putting a number out there, what Karen and I were thinking about, if we think that today the U.S. accounts for about 6% of Africa's trade, and we're about 20% of the global GDP, we see no reason why we shouldn't double what we're doing in the next 5 years. I think we should be incredibly ambitious about where we want to be, given the opportunities, even with that. And I think if you have big, bold ambitions, we're going to then make the changes we need to. And I think we can build off the leadership summit where we have the commitments and so forth, and this group, which I think represents a lot of diversity. We've got. I think we do have the Maslowian curve, Shelley, to your point. There's the broad view of what needs to be done with capital markets, institutional investors. There's the cold chains. There's the entrepreneurs. I think the idea of bringing in technology and maybe an institutional investor might not be bad, but I think we've got a group that's kind of representative of what that significant opportunity is. So I look forward to working with you on that. Karen, do you want to make some comments?
Thank you, Dominic. I'm Karen Daniel, and very, very privileged to serve as the CFO for Black & Veatch. Black & Veatch is a global engineering and construction company that provides infrastructure in energy, water, and telecom. And we are currently working on our growth initiatives in Africa, and I'm really delighted about the opportunity to serve on the council. I would like to thank Secretary Pritzker, President Obama, and the many government agencies that have been so very supportive along the way as we've been doing our work and coming together. To the council members, on behalf of Dominic and myself, we appreciate the very hard work that's been going on. We will have opportunities to do more work as we make our way forward in prioritizing and ultimately executing the work that we put together and the recommendations to fulfill President Obama's objectives for improving business in Africa. At Black & Veatch, we are 10,000 strong relative to the professionals that are out building a world of difference. We are going to celebrate our 100th anniversary this August. And I'm pleased to say that we've spent nearly half of those 100 years working in Africa, in different parts of Africa. And we've seen the opportunities that are there. The opportunities today are even greater. Dominic just ran through the economic facts and some of the other issues that we face. However, for us to really capture all of that potential, we really need to come together as a nation and create partnerships for collaboration so that we can then go to Africa and then partner in Africa and realize some of the great dreams that are in front of Africa. The opportunities, again, are immense, and we collectively have a lot of great ideas that we've covered in the last couple of days, and we're going to continue to work those through. Today we'll have some more invigorating discussion, as we talked last night with Secretary Pritzker. As far as the council's work is concerned, we have created the 8 recommendations that we'll go through today, and we really encourage the continuous dialogue that we've had for the last half day and really look for opportunities to maximize this really, really important and unique time in our collective history in doing business in Africa. There are multiple opportunities there on the trade side, but I would really be remiss if I didn't mention also there are a lot of natural resources and business opportunities in Africa, but Africa's greatest resource really are the people. And we have spent a lot of time at Black & Veatch really understanding what those needs are. The infrastructure needs are obvious, but we've talked about entrepreneurship and the Young African Leaders Initiative. That is really an important part of our work also. I'm personally thrilled that I'll have the opportunity to go to Africa next week and actually engage in leadership development with YALI participants. We're going to have 10 participate in the Black & Veatch Leadership Program as an indication that we need to also invest in the next generation of leaders in Africa. Dominic, I think at this point we can move into our discussion on the recommendations that have been put forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Karen. We're going to jump right into it. As you know, we've got the 4 work streams, and Karen and I are both going to just introduce just very briefly. I'm not going to give the backgrounds of people. I think we could look at the biographies, great people who are here. But I'm going to start, first of all, with the investment and access to capital, and Ed Matthias from Carlisle has been chairing that group. So over to you, Ed.
Good. Thank you very much. As I think you know, the council was divided into working groups to report back on specific subjects. Our panel was to really attract and mobilize capital, and then how can you develop financial markets. And I think both of these elements are prerequisites for growth and economic development. We know there are immense capital needs and also opportunities that I think will attract capital. You need strong financial markets, breadth, depth, and I would say standards in which international investors can have confidence. Let me, as a practitioner, just mention two areas. The debt markets. Africa, for the first time, had access to global capital. I think there was a landmark deal that Rwanda did, something like 8% for 10 years. The significance being there was no guarantee based on resources. We've had a slight setback, but you're starting to see the capital markets open up in that regard. Equities are a little more complicated. There are 29 exchanges in Africa, no linkages. The total market capitalization is about a third for sub-Saharan Africa of what India is. And these exchanges, it's hard to fathom, are very small. I think Kenya has something like 65 stocks listed, and they're highly concentrated, but they're going to grow over time, and this is absolutely critical to the economic development. So Peter is going to discuss our recommendations, how we increase awareness, and hopefully develop the capital markets. Peter?
Thanks, Ed. And just, by the way, those of you who don't have access to that information, you could certainly get it on a Bloomberg terminal if you would like to. Dominic said I'd have an opportunity for a commercial plug, so you indulge me.
And that's where I got it.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Ed, and Secretary Pritzker, the Department of Commerce and Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee, and council members for your continued dedication to Africa and your commitment to developing trade and investment strategies on the continent. As you know, Africa has developed into a global economic force, and Bloomberg is fully committed to an advanced economic partnership between the United States and Africa. We have 8 physical offices in 6 countries in Africa, but our presence extends to more than 45 countries, employing over 160 people on our payroll and another 200 people as stringers producing content for our Bloomberg News service. We are growing and will continue to grow and invest for the future. We work closely with African financial institutions, private companies, and central bankers to help them maximize efficiency, mitigate risk, and increase capital flows. This helps the local financial markets and helps attract more foreign investment. Bloomberg is currently working on several securities market development initiatives in Africa. For example, we collaborated with the local regulator in Nigeria to create a Nigerian bond trading platform and market surveillance system to bring a more transparent, liquid, and efficient bond market to Nigeria. We also recently collaborated with the African Development Bank to create an African bond index. We saw a clear need for a transparent and objective benchmark for sovereign debt in Africa. Consistent with our efforts to strengthen Africans' financial markets, I'm pleased to offer a recommendation for our subcommittee that is focused on attracting investment and access to capital by making Africa's capital markets more robust. Africa's capital markets are undergoing significant change that, over time, will facilitate an increased interest in the trading of all types of financial instruments throughout the continent. Africa's security commissions and exchanges are increasingly requesting the expertise of the public and private sector experts with security market development issues. African securities markets range from very developed to nascent with no legislative or regulatory frameworks in place. To that end, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has a technical assistance program that utilizes the Securities Exchange Commission and industry officials, as well as other seasoned practitioners, to provide training and capacity building to regulatory officials all over the world. However, the program is very limited on resources and essentially has no funding. This is why we recommend that the U.S. government and private sector explore ways to provide the program with the funding necessary to be successful throughout the African continent. We also recommend private participation in training to bolster these markets and provide expertise necessary for the development of trading infrastructure. To advance these goals and show our commitment to developing capital markets, it's my pleasure to announce this morning that Bloomberg is establishing a grant to the Financial Services Volunteer Corps to sponsor a technical assistance program in Africa. The FSVC is a not-for-profit, private-public partnership that helps to build sound financial systems in emerging market countries. This grant will fund a training and capacity building program on the continent in an effort to strengthen securities markets. The new initiative will have a positive impact on investment opportunities and African governments alike. And in addition to funding the grant, we will continue our commitment at Bloomberg to providing training via our terminal to African central bankers, securities regulators, and the private sector, and will also continue developing trading infrastructure. Similarly, I'd like to encourage other companies to share their expertise with those on the continent as well. And finally, I'm delighted to announce that Bloomberg has committed to hosting a business and economic summit in Africa in early 2016. The summit, tapping Bloomberg's editorial and analytical resources on the continent and beyond, will convene top executives and policymakers for a deeper look at Africa's domestic economies and an exploration of their roles in changing the global economy. Bloomberg journalists will lead conversations focused on issues including energy, technology, infrastructure, the opportunities and risks of doing business in the region, and strengthening of the capital markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So again, we've got, there are two specific recommendations around capital markets, as Ed and Peter have laid out, to really build those, as Ed described, fragmented markets, make them more robust, have the debt market. So again, just reminding us of what we said on that side. And on the institutional investment side, as Secretary Pritzker also mentioned, it's how do we mobilize more? It's a very tiny percent, less than 0.1% of institutional investors in North America invest in Africa, right? And so how do we get that number up? We have a lot of capital that's available, long-term capital, and I think so there's the notion of the roadshow to move it forward. But I'd suggest now we open it up for any comments or discussions. If other members who are on the group want to throw it in, let's do it. Go ahead.
Thank you, everybody, and Madam Secretary, for this opportunity. There was a discussion in the Finance Subcommittee about additional ways to bring in institutional capital, which has not yet risen to the level of recommendation because we really need some more input from other stakeholders. I live my world in the institutional investor community. I find there is a distinct lack of knowledge. That's why there's so little allocation to Africa. However, as I am out talking to people and trying to sell the Africa story to them, people are beginning to realize that this is the last frontier, that they need to at least understand what's going on. And once they do, they realize there's very limited access, not only to capital markets on the continent, but to other investable vehicles on other markets. So what we were discussing in the subcommittee was ways in which the U.S. government could work either with the development financial institutions or with other groups that are aggregating capital, whether for large infrastructure projects or for other investments, where this could be structured in a vehicle that would be investable by institutional investors. So our conclusion was the reason there's not a recommendation around this is that we need more input as to which government agencies could be involved, what are some of the areas in which the U.S. government may already be doing some of this work, and then how do we bring some of the other stakeholders, whether the institutional investors, the commercial banks, and the governments together to have a more robust discussion on this particular issue. So we're asking for some input here. Thank you.
Any other comments? Yeah, Jay?
Yeah, to that point, I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, but I do believe that credit enhancement is also an area that if the government, through the different agencies and funding mechanisms, have that ability versus a debt or equity or things that are also very valuable, because then you can mobilize private capital a lot better with that backing. And I think you can get a multiplicative effect for it. So I think that's something else we ought to tie into that.
Can I add a couple of other thoughts? One of the things that we suggest, you're looking for ways to have more effective dissemination of economic data and statistics. And that way, investors will have a clear macroeconomic picture. Additionally, the DBIA Council should look for ways to build the capacity of statistical agencies locally and how they distribute information to the public domain and the timing of the distribution of that information. We also support clearer reporting rules for market-sensitive data, perhaps a single reporting avenue for any news or results, such as an exchange or regulatory newswire that is publicly disseminated. And we suggest that we continue to take steps to promote electronic trading and settlement to enhance liquidity and ease access to local capital markets. We also support formalizing accounting standards, such as moving to IFRS, to be able to further add integrity to the markets, liquidity, and transparency into the markets as well.
I suggest if you want to ask a question, just because I won't be able to see it, just let's do this kind of process if people want to do that. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Wanda Felton. I'm with the Export-Import Bank. And I would, just as a follow-on to Melissa's comments and to Jay's, Ex-Im Bank has been able to issue guaranteed loans that were into the private debt markets where institutional investors have bought these securities. It's been primarily in their transportation segment. But it is an example of how a credit enhancement can create some liquidity and bring in other institutional investors. And just like to just say that we concur fully with the recommendations of that subcommittee. We have also provided capital to support portfolio companies that are looking to expand in a variety of markets and industries, portfolio companies of private equity firms, and we can support project finance transactions that have infrastructure or private equity funds as investors in them, because they provide some comfort to us because of the improved capital structure and enhanced credit quality, as well as the managerial and technical expertise that those firms provide. We've done it in the solar industry in India, in wind in Central America, and we think that, it creates very attractive opportunities for Ex-Im Bank to put in attractively priced debt.
Thanks, Wanda. Elizabeth?
Yeah, thanks very much. So as you can imagine, as OPIC, the U.S. government's development finance institution, we've been working and investing in Africa for the better part of 30 years, I personally, as well as the agency. And I think the experience that we've had in the last few years is testament to the attractiveness of the investment opportunity, as well as to the growth in U.S. Investor interest. Right now, about a quarter of our $18 billion portfolio is in Africa, which is much, much more than it was in single digits only a few years ago. And we're doing about 4 or 5 times the annual commitments in Africa that we were only 6 or so years ago. And actually, a full third of our $6 billion private equity portfolio is in Africa. And this too is strongly up. Perhaps more importantly, the performance of our portfolio in Africa is consistent with the rest of the emerging markets. Risk-adjusted returns are excellent, and write-offs have been also excellent. But I have 3 very specific recommendations in addition to the very useful recommendations that you all offered up. The first one sort of tees off something Melissa was saying earlier, and that is, I think it would be very powerful, and we were saying this a little bit over dinner last night, that the embassy staff that are the front line for many African and American businesses are fully equipped to understand what tools the U.S. government has at its disposal to help U.S. businesses successfully invest in these markets. What's the difference between an export opportunity and an investment opportunity? Where does AID plug in, and where can US TDA plug in? So I think investing in the fluency of our frontline marketing staff would be a very powerful thing to do. The second thing was, and this is teeing off something I think Ed was mentioning last night, in the context of deepening the capital markets, one very concrete thing we all need to worry about and think about is the currency risk. There's no yield curve in most of these markets, and there's certainly no swap market, and it's very, very difficult to ask investors to bear the currency risk. So we, I know, as OPIC, we provide long-term debt finance and insurance, but we do it in dollars. So one suggestion I have is that we need to work perhaps with OMB and Treasury to really think about what is our risk appetite for extending loans in local currency, and what are the structures that we can do, that we can deploy to be able to do that. So that would be a very concrete, specific thing that this group could help us work on. And then the third thing is I would be remiss if, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say, one other thing we could do is make sure that the U.S. government agency who's charged with helping to catalyze these flows through financing and risk mitigation is fully equipped and resourced. And right now for OPIC to be as small as we are and as ill-equipped without, I think someone was saying last night, with no equity instrument, with no grant instrument, and with a number of policy constraints. But more importantly, we're so small, as I said last night, we're smaller than our Dutch equivalent. And we're a tiny fraction of what the Chinese and the Japanese are doing. So I think making sure that the U.S. government agencies like EXIM and OPIC are fully equipped would be one concrete thing that could be done to advance this. But I think those recommendations were very useful, and I'd be happy to add further thoughts on that.
I think Teresa, and we'll close here and then let Secretary Pritzker sort of any reflections from the session. Teresa.
Thank you. I'm Teresa Clark with Africa.com. Madam Secretary, thank you very much for the leadership you're providing. And one of the things that I think we might want to incorporate into these recommendations is the sense of urgency that you have brought to these discussions, and appreciating that we really want to achieve specific results over the course of the next 20 months or so. And so to that end, when I think about these recommendations on the investment and access to capital front, I think there are three things that strike me. Dominic mentioned the word bold, and I think that given the size of the opportunity here, we can be bold, and we might want to be measurable in what we seek to do. We say that we want to increase investment, but by how much, over what period of time? Have something that we can use to determine whether we've been successful or not when we look back at these recommendations. I think secondly, in terms of being strategic, I think it's important for us to recognize that we are competing against others who aren't thinking about just how to pick up a few extra basis points in their investments, but are looking over the long term at the very important strategic aspects of being invested in Africa. The Chinese are not looking at this in order to get a little bit more return tomorrow, but to think about access to resources that will fuel their country going forward over the next 50 years. And so I think that it's important for us to put that into context and to recognize the other benefits, that it's not just about making money, but that there are some very important strategic reasons for the United States to be involved. And lastly, I think when it comes to being specific, I think that we spoke last night about how these recommendations can be most helpful, and one of the things that I heard was that we should be very, very granular in our thinking. And I think to Shelley's points last night, we should think about Maslow's theory and see, what is it that's at sort of the base that needs to be done here, instead of thinking about just regulatory improvements, but what are the very simple things that are happening on the ground that can make a big difference, and to focus on some very specific actionable items in that regard.
Hello, Marisa Lago from Treasury, and being from Treasury, it's a delight to see this focus on the private sector and private capital. I wanted to bring just one additional player into the room, which is, two, the World Bank and the African Development Bank. When we think about these institutions, of course, the most visible sign is the infrastructure that they finance, but they also provide technical assistance on how to improve the enabling environment, on how to put in place some of the underpinnings that Peter mentioned that are essential to both having functioning capital markets and to attract investment. And I don't think that there is a continent that has done a better job than Africa in using the World Bank's doing business interests to drive those types of reforms.
Thank you. Thank you. Two things I just wanted to comment on. One we talked about a little bit earlier, which is the Commerce Department is going to launch a Mobilizing U.S. Private Sector Capital Roadshow, and we would really love, the objective being to introduce more U.S. firms to Africa, financial firms to Africa, have them hear from African leaders about the opportunities, as well as to better understand true risk management. And so I think that's an area where we would love any kind of insight or additional advice from you as to how to make that successful as a first outing, if you will. I do want to announce that in November, the East African community has accepted our proposal to partner with us on a forum in Tanzania. So there is beginning to be real engagement on a regional level, which I think is helpful. The others I briefly mentioned earlier, we would like to your recommendation about an online toolkit is, we agree with that, but what we need is following up on, I think as Teresa's point about being specific and granular, is, how do we identify lists of trusted African partners? We want your thoughts about being able to list actionable infrastructure projects, as well as case studies of how to, so that it can help people who want to enter the market. This whole idea of a toolkit needs to be further fleshed out, and so we would love more from you about that, so that it can be effective and useful to someone.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Pritzker, for that. I think a lot of good other ideas. I'm not going to, for the sake of time, summarize them. I think we're all doing that. I think it also just reflects the fact with these 8, I think there were about 20 recommendations originally. We sort of tried to boil it down, but I think there's surfaced up some ones that we can do a little more work on and a little more specificity around some of the ideas, which we'll do. Karen, over to you.
That wasn't on.
Yeah, switch it. Cozy up.
This mic is not connected, there's no cable.
You're doing a fine job, Shelley.
And I noticed my name tag was put there purposely as well. But it probably comes as no surprise that Walmart would be interested in the supply chain. In most countries that we operate in, we reside at the end of the supply chain. When it comes to an emerging market and emerging markets like we see on the continent, at many times you find yourself all the way through the supply chain, from the point of creation or the farm all the way through. And as we worked on our subcommittee, we found that each of us were intimately involved in all parts of the supply chain. And if I could speak frankly and give you some background on what drove these recommendations, we talked to a lot of stakeholders, shareholders, people within our own organizations, and others. And a very common theme emerged, and that was we can all work incredibly hard, and we can come up with unique opportunities on the continent to import and export products. We see opportunities for manufacturing. We see opportunities for agricultural growth. But if we cannot move product reliably and consistently, if we can't keep that conveyor belt running, then all of those efforts may in fact be unsuccessful or costly and uncompetitive. And this is true across all product categories. And there's some very unique attributes to the African continent. We have 16 landlocked countries, more than any other continent. So the hard work that each little product has to do just to find its way to the coast is arduous. And making that slow, making that complicated, makes people turn the other way, and in many cases can make our products uncompetitive. A few quick examples of that. There's a great climate, a great opportunity to grow products like cashews. But when that product sits at a port or sits at a point of customs for 2 weeks, waiting for someone to come by and stamp, the cost of that product has now made that growing area less competitive. For apparel, a fantastic workforce and raw materials. But when transportation, logistics make that product 1 to 2 months late to market on something that is seasonal, it now makes that product uncompetitive and forces buyers to choose other options. When raw materials are classed incorrectly and are misclassed into a higher duty rate, although the original cost quotation was low, at the end of the manufacturing cycle, that is now raised in price and has become uncompetitive and caused people to go elsewhere for their raw materials. So our first recommendation is about facilitating the movement of goods and facilitating trade, and it is critical. The nice news is that we don't have to start from scratch. Our public sector partners have done some incredible work, as well as our private sector partners. And just this past January, the U.S. delivered its letter of acceptance to the WTO on the Trade Facilitation Agreement. When you read that agreement, when you look at the details of that agreement, you can see many of the things that we have been talking about for the last day and a half in order to facilitate trade. This agreement is a real milestone in addressing the barriers of movement and the clearance of goods. And so we have already been a champion for promoting this agreement, but our recommendation is for us to take that even a step farther, for the U.S. government to actively enable TFA implementation in Africa and to focus on a few of those clear priorities, the clear priorities that we have talked about, adopting new technologies and automating systems at custom facilities. And that's not just for speed. That is for transparency. Promoting international standards and global best practices with recommendations from the private sector. Encouraging regional harmonization. We have seen some great efforts in East Africa, but we also need to reward those efforts particularly. There is a difference between fair and equal. We like to treat everything equally. We talk about Africa in many cases as a single entity, when we all know it's not. And we want to be fair, but we don't need to be equal with those that are participating, with those that are changing, with those that are modernizing, and with those that are transparent, should get and receive more. The establishment of interagency committees, we talked about it today. There is so much work going on in the public sector, whether it's the USTA, whether it's the USDA, whether it's our partners sitting around the table. So it may be time for an intra-agency committee focused just on these efforts, on some of the baseline barriers to entry that we need to be successful. Our second area of recommendation addresses the movement of perishable goods. And when we talk about the cold chain and the perishable supply chain, oftentimes people think we're talking solely about refrigeration. Although refrigeration is incredibly important, just the safety and security of food supply in transit is also important. Having things be pest-free, having them be weather-free, having them be safe and dry is equally as important to the perishable food chain. This area is particularly exciting because that cold chain and food chain is the perfect match of U.S. expertise and technology to African need. So the idea of matching up the USDA and other technology partners with the incredible opportunity that exists in Africa. So we recommend that the U.S. government study and report on the current state of food supply chains, working with the private sector and other stakeholders to identify the gaps that may exist. Right now, we are fragmented and we are siloed. So many of us in the private sector are into Africa, and we are looking at each particular country, and we are building the appropriate supply chain, be it perishable or dry goods, that's best for our individual product. But we aren't leveraging each other, we aren't leveraging the strength and the growth, and there are gaps within that supply chain that working together in combination with the government could move us significantly faster and compete with other countries that are doing it in a much more coordinated effort to speed things up. We are also encouraging the administration to consider risk mitigation programs that has come up a few times today, and incentivize the private sector investments for those that are taking the risk. There aren't that many places left in the world to get a first mover status. There are 50-some great places for us right now to get first mover status in Africa. And we can do it, but the risk is there. So finding ways to mitigate that risk with partnerships is terrific. There was particular interest in our subcommittee at looking at the elements of programs that have already been successful around the world. This cannot be the U.S. coming into African nations, providing our expertise with our own experts, and then leaving. This has to be about our ability to teach, train, and grow, and make Africa a sustainable continent, make each nation sustainable. So there are some tremendous examples from around the world where we have provided internships, training, scholarships. And I think continuing to activate and build on the success of those would be instrumental to the long-term sustainable growth. And finally, we see opportunities for other agencies to continue in this momentum space. We've talked about it a bit before, but the USDA and the USTA on meeting the standards of the cold chain and treatment of storage and helping to speed up the growth curve of those African nations. So in conclusion, we're lucky in that we recognize that our public sector colleagues have already done some great work in this area. But if we can narrow that focus down and utilize this committee to speed to success on some of those baseline initiatives, we'll be able to move up the ladder much quicker. And at this point, I would open it up to any of my other 3 committee members for anything that they would like to add.